In this week's lesson, we'll talk about the origins of the Cold War, which is, of course, the time period post-World War II until 1991, really the fall of the Soviet Empire. And so we'll talk about that, how that came about, how it really began, and what the policy was in the United States at the very beginning of the Cold War. In the next lesson, we'll talk more about the latter part of the Cold War, or at least maybe the middle part of it, and when the Cold War really starts to heat up. But in this lesson, we're just going to talk about the basic background behind it, how it really begins. So after the war was over, it was a battle between two ideologies. Okay, so in the United States, you had capitalism and free enterprise. We had developed the atomic bomb. And the United States really at that time believed that their security depended on the stability of Europe and Asia. So it gets out of this, completely out of this isolationist mentality to what we're more like today, honestly, which is the feeling that we need to be involved in outside conflicts outside our borders. And then, of course, the Soviet Union in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, and so the communism is the system that's prevalent there at that time, and they wanted to reshape the world into their own image. Okay, so you have these two competing ideologies that go to battle with each other. Both physical battle, not directly, that's why they call it a Cold War, but that and just ideological spying, all kinds of things, but we'll get into depth in. So really, one of the biggest problems was that at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, before the end of the war, even though, Stalin was one of the allies with Churchill and with FDR, nobody really trusted each other, right? Stalin had promised at that time that he would hold free elections in these satellite states that would be under their control, but we know that that doesn't really happen. After the war, the Soviets implement communist governments in all of these areas, Poland, Hungary, Romania, places like that. The United States begins a policy, and this is important, called containment. Okay, there was actually a Soviet expert, his name was George Kennan, and that's this guy here in the bottom right. And he had an idea of how America should approach this. He called for he created this, what we consider a blueprint for this new policy called the long telegram. They call it long because it was 8,000 words long. That's ridiculously long, right? It develops a policy of containment. And the goal was to keep communism within its existing borders. Don't let it spill out, right? So he basically felt that the United States wouldn't risk a war with us. And, this is what he's banking his policy on. So containment, ideally, I have this bottle of Topo Chico, right? And it's not going to spill onto my keyboard unless unless I open it, unless it spills out, right? But otherwise, it's pretty harmless, right? It's not going to hurt my keyboard otherwise. And that's the idea. That's what containment is. Just make sure it stays in the borders of where it already exists now, and then you'll be okay, because the United States or USSR isn't going to bank going to war with Russia. So that's Kennan's idea behind the idea of containment. So this term, the Iron Curtain, I know you guys have probably heard this before, and there's actually a really great video that explains where this came from, so I encourage you to watch that short video. But basically, this was Winston Churchill. He coins this phrase, and I think at the time, too, he feels a little more tension from Russia at the very beginning of the Cold War because he's physically closer to them. We're kind of, we're separated from that. But he comes to Missouri in the United States in 1947, in March of 1947, and he delivers the speech to the American people that essentially illustrates that there was an iron curtain that had descended upon the European continent. And it wasn't obviously a real curtain. It wasn't a physical wall that separated them, but more of an ideological wall. And he was concerned about the rights of the people beyond that wall. And he also, from that too, Truman, from the speech itself, announces that the Soviet Union and the United States are in a global ideological conflict. So that really kind of marks the beginning, or at least our acknowledgement of the beginning of the war. So here's, a political cartoon that's kind of like showing that viewpoint of it. So obviously this is a political cartoon, so it's exaggerated, but you can see, Winston Churchill's over here trying to figure out what's going on beyond the wall, and it looks horrible and undeveloped, kind of ugly background there. So one of the first things, the way that President Truman really approaches this is by issuing something known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, basically what that said was, in Truman, when he issues this document, there was a threat of Greece and Turkey specifically that were threatened of a communist uprising. Now, in reality, there wasn't any real evidence that this was the Soviets infiltrating Greece and Turkey trying to instill communism. This was like an internal uprising, which was not uncommon, especially post-World War II, when there was a lot of disconnect. The government was very disorganized. So, it's just another way to approach government. And so there was stirrings, but it was within the borders of the government. But needless to say, America had maybe learned its lesson from isolationism. And so Truman pushes Congress to supply $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. This becomes like the way that America is going to approach any government that is threatening or is threatened to have a communist uprising, where we throw money, quite a bit of money at them. So Truman promises to help other nations against communism. This becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, okay? Now I want you to be keeping a little tally up, because I always have a lot of students wonder about why we are so deeply in debt. And I would argue that the Cold War is mainly one of the biggest reasons we are. We spend an enormous amount of money in the Cold War, so keep those little calculators tallying. So just so you physically get an idea of where exactly Turkey and Greece are, if you're not familiar already, but you can see this is a smaller or bigger outlay of it, and this is a blow up of it here. But this is where Greece and Turkey are. You can see strategically why those would be important locations too, to make sure that it remained free. Okay, like I mentioned, Truman Doctrine becomes like the guiding spirit behind the American foreign policy, and it's going to set a precedent. This is also going to be the line in the sand where the National Security Council is created, and so is the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. So the beginnings of the Central Intelligence Agency come from Truman Doctrine, from the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, another plan that goes into place is one known as the Marshall Plan. So as you can imagine, the fact that the war was physically fought in Europe, right, just absolutely decimated not only Asia, but also the European continent. And there was a lot of suffering in Western Europe, and the United States was very concerned about it. George Marshall, who was one of the leading generals during World War II, becomes the Secretary of State under Truman, and he has an economic plan to help Europe recover. And that was the Marshall Plan. Keep those calculators going. $14 billion in grants and loans to Western Europe. Okay? His idea was, if the Western European countries begin to fall economically, that will naturally lead them to possibly look at communism. But if we're able to keep them afloat, then that will keep them from becoming communist. And remember, our guiding idea is containment. So we don't want communism to spread, right? But this is going to really solidify that division, really make that solid, iron curtain, because we are giving so much financial aid to Europe, Western Europe. And you can see, this is if you're just interested in where exactly the money was going. This tells you exactly, how much money was going to each part of it. And this is a political cartoon, kind of satirically saying the American taxpayer. You can tell that Europe is almost seen as like a large, dumb, for lack of a better term, and we're trying to get it off of its training wheels. So, okay, so the other thing that's happening, and of course in Asia, is the reconstruction of Japan. So Japan itself, after World War II, was occupied by the United States. Douglas MacArthur, he's going to be important in a little bit too. He was the commanding leader behind the Pacific Front during World War II, and he will become in charge of the occupation of Japan. Now, what we do in Japan, number one, is that we have Japan write a new constitution, and in it, women are included in the vote. And also, importantly, is Article 9, which says that the Japanese can only maintain a military the size enough for defense, a very small military. And, you know, the United States for a couple years is there. So it occupies basically from 1945 to 1948. By the 1950s, Japanese economy is doing super well. And so we kind of leave Japan. One of the biggest events that happens, and my favorite event of the Cold War, was the Berlin airlift. Okay, but let me explain exactly what was going on in Germany at the time. And I encourage you to watch the video that goes with this, because this explains it a lot better. Okay, but you might remember from our lesson talking about the Yalta Conference, Germany itself was divided into a Western Germany and an Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany is going to be occupied by the Soviet Union. It's going to be run by the Soviet Union. The rest are, you know, this is obviously Great Britain and France, and this is the United States in yellow there, okay? And so this will make up Western Free Germany. Berlin was the capital city that was sitting smack dab in the middle of Eastern Germany. So this is a blow up of Berlin. This is where it was. And you can see that it's divided up similarly. So literally, there's a small little itty bitty portion of Berlin that is free. The rest of it, Eastern Berlin, and everything surrounding it is all communist, okay? So this is going to lead to a lot of tension pretty early on during the Cold War. And one of the biggest issues was the Western influence. The Soviets didn't like that. The video, it explains the Deutschmark and how when America introduced the Deutschmark, a new currency, into Berlin, they saw this as, you know, too much of a flex, I guess. And so what ends up happening is that the Soviets block all of Berlin. So they literally surround Western Berlin and create a blockade to try to starve the people of West Berlin out and force them into communism. Okay, so what happens after that is, since the United States cannot get, or the Allies cannot get food into the people of Berlin, right, of Western Berlin, they will bring supplies to them through the air. And this becomes known as the Berlin Airlift, or Operation Vittles. So just like I mentioned before with the map, it was divided into 4 zones. This prosperous life obviously creates a lot of tension. He creates a blockade. The U.S. and Britain supply West Berlin with a massive airlift. This lasts for 1 year, and it doesn't stop. It's nonstop, day and night, 24 hours a day. It kind of shows how far the United States was willing to go for the containment of communism. Okay, just to keep this in mind, Britain and the United States, a plane took off every 30 seconds supplying food, medical supplies, clothing, 5,000 tons of supplies a day, even candy, 2.3 tons of cargo, over 300,000 flights a day. Just an unbelievable, over 300,000 flights in total, sorry, not a day, but unbelievable amount that they're willing to go through. So this is seen as a success, because at the end, you know, the Soviets relent. They release the blockade, and we'll talk about the next step they'll take, which is, of course, the Berlin Wall. That happens in 1961, though. So it was, even though it seems like a little much, right, for to keep containment of communism, it does show how far the United States was willing to go. Another thing that happens, and this is threatening to the United States, is the development of the atomic bomb by the Soviets. Okay, so the United States and the former Allies are very concerned about this, and so they form an alliance in order to stop the Soviet expansion and stop the Soviet threat. So this starts with 10 Western countries, the United States and Canada, or Western European countries, I should say. They form NATO, which is still in existence today, right? In retaliation for this, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact, and it was just done as a response to them. Interestingly enough, though, it's not really a thing, considering the fact that they didn't have the choice. The people that were in the Warsaw Pact didn't have a choice to be in it, because they were Soviet satellite states. And this shows, like, all the countries at that time by 1955 that were involved in both the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Of course, NATO has grown, and the Warsaw Pact is obviously gone now. Another thing that happens that becomes very concerning, again in 1949, is that Mao Zedong overthrows the Chinese government. Okay, in response to that, Truman did not recognize the new Republic of China, or this People's Republic of China, refused to see it in the CN, recognized instead Taiwan's illegitimate government. Okay, or I'm sorry, recognized Taiwan's government as the legitimate government and thought that the People's Republic of China was the illegitimate one. Also, in response to this, the National Security Council that was formed passed something called NSC 68. Now, this essentially said that we were in this epic battle, and it equates the communism to slavery, which is a little ironic, but that's the way that they put it at that time. But what NSC 68 does is really scare the crap out of everybody, and it increases military spending to a ridiculous amount. Okay, here's a picture of Mao Zedong, of course. This should look super familiar, right? Like a lot of communist propaganda. And the last thing we'll talk about in this video is the Korean War. And I want to apologize in advance. I'm not going to do it the justice maybe that it deserves, but this is a survey class, so I don't get to go into too much depth into one particular topic. But basically, just like Germany was divided after World War II because the Japanese had occupied the Korean Peninsula, the United Nations divides Korea up into a north and a south, a communist north and a free south. But in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Okay, wanted to make it communist and take over the entire peninsula. In response, the new United Nations ignites and sends a force led by U.S. forces and General Douglas MacArthur. And remember him, I told you to think about him, okay? Anyway, so he's able to actually push the communists out of South Korea because it actually made it almost to the South China Sea. It pushes them up and all the way almost to the Chinese border until the Chinese come in and help out and give aid to the North Koreans. Now, MacArthur wanted to use the nuclear bomb. He wanted to use atomic bomb. Truman says no. This turns into a big battle between MacArthur and Truman in response to MacArthur was like outwardly critical, and even in the newspapers and in the press was criticizing him, and so Truman fires him. He kicks him out. Okay, so he brings in another general to take over, and from there it ends up 3 years later until Eisenhower is elected president, which they basically call a truce, or not really, there wasn't really a truce. It was an armistice, which basically means they agreed to lay down their weapons, but no treaty was made by that. 38th parallel becomes that dividing line. Okay, and here's a map of it. This kind of shows you, if those of you that are, military historians or you like military history, you can pause it and take a look at the offensive, and it gives you kind of the time period that these things happen. Almost, I always tell my students it kind of looks like, this armistice line is almost like the 50-yard line, and it's almost like a football game because they're pushing back until they finally get to the 50-yard line. The score is 0-0. All right, so what are the effects of it? 33,000 Americans are killed. 1 million Korean soldiers, but 2 million civilians die. This does officially draw the line in the sand. The Cold War is now global. Japan becomes part of this free world, and so does South Korea. And now there's going to be alliances all throughout, not only Southeast Asia, but also in the Middle East. So that is it for this lesson. And in the next lesson, we'll talk about how the Cold War really heats up.